Well, universal childcare programs are seen by many as the answer to challenges faced by many working parents, and it's certainly being promoted that way by our federal government. But is it really the best solution? Well, today's guest isn't a fan of it. Joining us from Ottawa, the Ottawa area, is Andrea Mrozek, a senior fellow with the nonpartisan think tank Cardis. Andrea, thanks so much for being with us today to discuss this.
Yes, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So, Andrea, you recently wrote an article in the National Post with the headline National Daycare Program Builds Federal Monopoly at Expense of Parents. So, can you maybe explain what you mean by that and how this is happening? Is it basically the government subsidies messing with the free market, or what's going on?
Yeah, so the reason why we say that the new system is being built at the expense of parents is because so few parents have access to the type of care that the government is choosing to build. So, generally, in all of the provinces, each province is slightly different, but the funding for $10 a day daycare goes to licensed not for profit care. So, across the country, you have a majority of parents who are not using that type of care. In some cases, maybe they didn't have access. In other cases, equally, they didn't choose it, they didn't want it. So we basically see the government putting their finger on the scales and saying, this is the kind of care we are subsidizing, this is the kind of care you're going to use. But that kind of care isn't available for all parents with children under 6, let alone children under the age of 12. So that's kind of what's happening with regards to the government choice in the new $10 a day childcare system.
Right. Interesting. So, what do you think the government is trying to achieve with these subsidies?
I do think that initially, at least, it was about the cheaper childcare. I think they're quite enamored with the idea of European style systems. There's reasons why those systems may work better in Europe than here. A lot of that has to do with parental choice and the ways in which we view child rearing here and the diversity of care options that parents are currently choosing. But they're really bought into a model of a daycare system that I believe is out of date and not it's just not fitting with what parents are doing. I know we all know someone with 3 kids and they chose different care options for each child, and sometimes different care option for the child, for one child, as they go through different ages. So I think the government wants this sort of European style system, if we could call it that, although Europe has a lot of different models, but we could get into that. Um, and so they're choosing that at the expense of what Canadian parents would actually desire.
Okay, and it sounds very confusing to have 3 kids in 3 different daycares. That sounds very frustrating. I can just
I
imagine that
there.
household in the morning. But yeah, and I mean, it's one thing to have affordable childcare, right, which we're all for. But if there's a major shortage of these affordable childcare spaces, then how much of a benefit is it to Canadian parents, really?
Well, so when it comes to childcare, we actually at Cardis define childcare as the care of a child no matter who does it. And that is a very broad definition, and it's one that is very inclusive. So you could have a mom doing no waged work at all. She's doing childcare. You can have a mother doing full-time waged work, and she's also doing childcare. Let's be honest, at the beginning, at the end of her day. So this is not about the mommy wars or saying we prefer one particular course of action for parents. It's really about enhancing parents' choices and acknowledging that people are doing different things and that those choices are legitimate. More than legitimate, it's actually what parents want. So we have this broad definition of childcare. The government has a very, very, very limited definition of childcare. And by that, I mean not even recognizing paid childcare on the ground as it exists today. So licensed childcare is just a section, just a percentage of all of the professional childcare that parents are accessing. A lot of parents will be choosing unlicensed day homes, for example, for the geographic proximity. There's a lot of reasons why parents make different choices for their childcare needs.
Yeah, definitely. Now, why are so many private childcare providers unhappy with these government subsidies?
Yeah, a lot of them signed on with definitely appreciating cheaper childcare that parents were supposed to be getting. I think they're mostly upset because they've been put in the position of intermediary or unpaid accountants, basically, for the system. So there's a lot of bureaucratic work that goes along with navigating the new grants that bring down the cost of childcare. I do know childcares who have had to hire a person to navigate the grants and the applications and the different hoops they have to jump through. So it's extremely bureaucratically onerous. I think that comes through as a major reason, and the governments across the country and in Alberta haven't acknowledged the amount of work that is for childcares. And the government's also been fairly unpredictable in how they've navigated the new system. So, for example, childcares have been asked to sign on to something that basically ensures their viability as a business. But they've been given like a weekend, for example, to read through reams and reams of paperwork. So I think we can all see how that would be very frustrating, taxing, and difficult for small childcares who are in the business not because they love paperwork, but because they love children.
Yeah, that could potentially cause a lot of problems for sure. So, what does the research say about the quality of care in government funded daycare as compared to, say, family care at home?
So just to be clear, all daycare is government funded to a greater or lesser extent, but what you're getting at there is the quality question. And so at Cardis, we are really concerned with all of the types of childcare, and that's not something that we've really studied fully in Canada. The biggest, best peer-reviewed study that we have that included thousands of participants over years, like a decade plus, is from the United States, and it found that center-based care ranked the lowest quality on various choices. And they did attempt to contrast with every form of non-maternal, so basically anything that wasn't the mom, could include dads, grandparents, etc. And they found the quality of care in centers was the lowest. There's a lot of caveats I'd put on that. There is good quality center-based care, but I think that as we funnel more and more kids in that direction, it gets increasingly difficult to fulfill quality requirements because you're pushing more kids into it. There will be pressure to perhaps change ratios, which is one of the quality aspects, right? Yeah, the pressure would be to have more kids per staff member, for example, simply to accommodate more people. That immediately lowers the quality. So I would simply say on that question, we're just not having a very robust quality discussion in Canada at the moment.
Do you know what the percentages of kids that stay at home with their parents compared to the number of kids that go out of home for daycare?
Yeah. So at a bare minimum, it's 40% of kids under 6 are with their parents. That's a bare minimum because of different factors in the data. For example, when they count kids as using childcare, they'll count kids using preschool, but preschool is something that happens at an extremely part-time basis, maybe 2 hours a day, 3 days a week. That might be a preschool program. So a preschool kid is essentially also home with parents, but they get counted as using childcare. So 40% would be, I think, a bare minimum of kids at home with their parents.
Okay, interesting. And what percentage of childcare operators are government funded as compared to purely private childcare businesses?
Yeah, I tried to allude to this earlier on. I don't believe there's any purely private. I think the $10 a day system that we have now is the latest, greatest funding grant. It is the largest for sure, and it's been consolidated via legislation into a system. However, all daycares were using various grants, I think, before for something like space creation, even if it was a private operator. So it's been a long, slow drip of government money to get to the point of the $10 a day system. I think that daycare is expensive, and that's the nature of the business. There's no real efficiencies that you could build in because you're dealing with children. So, yeah, I think daycares, private or not for profit, have been using government grants and subsidies for a very long time.
And do we know what the actual need or demand is for low cost childcare? Like, is that at the top of the list of priorities for parents, or would they rather use other options to care for their children?
So we are definitely the people who see that big picture, a big ecosystem of care, and a preference for using other forms of care. If you listen exclusively to the mainstream media, you could be forgiven for thinking that there is a huge shortage, a huge demand for care. In certain markets, that may be true. Even in the same market, in a large urban center, you may find places where there's a shortage in one area and then a surplus of spaces in another. I personally have done research into revealing surplus childcare spaces in markets where we were told there were absolutely none. So it's a tricky thing. I don't think that parents are clamoring, though, for exclusive center based care. What they are interested in is help with their childcare needs. And that could come in the form of money to parents, it could come in the form of tax reductions, et cetera. But there's a lot of different options and a lot of different levers that we're kind of not using when we turn towards this system that the government's chosen.
Mhm. Now, Andrea, it seems that part of the Liberal government universal child care goal is to see more women enter the workforce. So, is this program, is it's forking out $30 billion on this? So, are we actually seeing a significant increase in women joining the workforce because of this?
Yeah, that was one of the reasons was put forward for having this system, was to increase the number of mothers of young children who would be doing waged work, and that would increase the GDP and help the economy, more workers, et cetera. I don't think we see that kind of influx into the workforce. The in English Canada, every province but Quebec, you already had a fairly high number of mothers in the workforce. Um, there was a kind of a theory that we could do what Quebec did. Quebec, when they introduced their program of a system of early learning and childcare um, almost 20 years ago, they did see an influx of women into the workforce. But that was because they had a lower percentage of mothers doing waged work to start with. And English Canada, the rest of Canada didn't actually share those percentages. So to tease up that percentage is difficult. There's been a recent study just very concretely saying the $30 billion has been allocated to this childcare program without budging that number at all. So I tend to think that would be, intuitively in my gut, that really resonates. It's going to be hard to do that with an already with a percentage of women already working.
Yeah. So, is it a flaw then that the government seems to be favoring only the one option? Would it be better maybe to make a variety of options available?
Well, certainly these agreements need to be made very much more flexible and I mean immediately as they renegotiate the next round of the next 5 years, we need to see vastly more flexibility incorporated. We need to see private care included. It's absolutely essential that all forms of care be included. And we would say that ultimately parents and family members can also be in providing childcare, and as such, funding the parents is an extremely effective and efficient way of ensuring that everybody can access the billions of dollars that currently the very few are actually getting.
If you were in charge, what kinds of options could they make available to parents that might be better? Do you think?
Well, I mean, what we've seen, I think, in many of the moves of the government is that they're steamrolling over this ecosystem of care. So, for example, smaller providers are finding it hard to stay afloat with the current funding model. It's just not easy for them to navigate all of the bureaucratic hoops and still stay in business. So, as for, I don't personally believe that it's the role of government to ensure particular forms of care are available. I think the most equitable way of allowing parents to access money is to give parents the money and then allow for them to access care in their local communities that works for them. And it might even be a parent in the home. That's not quite the same thing as saying government should provide X, Y, or Z. It would be a bit more organic than that. But certainly, the option to have the cheaper childcare is not available right now for, as we discussed, the majority of families. And that strikes me as being extremely unfair.
Now, at the top there, you were mentioning that the federal government's kind of modeling against the European system. So, with that said, are there any other countries around the world who have a better childcare system in place that we could potentially learn from?
Yeah, well, we've always, we have taken some time to study the systems in Europe, and they are different. So it's not fair, actually. I said European style daycare. That's not really fair. Models that we appreciate more, if you were to look at Finland over and above Sweden, for example. So Sweden had this idea of basically more. It feels like Canada's following more of a Swedish path, where all children go to one type of care. In Finland, you had more funds available, so parents could choose childcare or take in cash to be at home, and that was I think it's available for the first 3 years of a child's life. So again, any system in Europe that has a greater degree of flexibility. So Finland over Sweden, that's one thing I can point to very concretely. Each European country has their own slightly different approach. And one of the reasons why it's European anything is difficult in Canada is because we're not Europe. I think English Canada has a vastly different tradition and culture that we're coming from. And so it makes emulating these types of programs all the more difficult. But if we do go down the path of creating a system, then we should max out on the flexibility for Canadian parents.
It looks like we are very close to being out of time here, but Andrea, thank you so much for being with us today. Appreciate having you on.
Yeah, thanks for having this conversation.
Absolutely. Andrea Mrozek is a senior fellow with the think tank Cardis.